Is there a realistic scenario an alternative to the dollar could emerge and the dollar could lose its preeminent status? I was reading this morning that China is talking about some multipolar currency that they'd like to put together to compete with the dollar. And then lastly, what are some steps that Congress could take now that would signal credibility to markets about Congress's commitment to keeping a stable dollar and achieving a sustainable fisc, so that we can avoid the debt doom loop that will otherwise enter as interest rates get pushed up. So those are some of the topics that I wanted to put on the table for discussion and then see where people are at.
Those all sound great. Let me start us off with one specific historical question for you, Romina, or anyone else if someone else has the answer. Are there instances of countries that have been in a situation we would consider broadly similar where they've gotten out of it? And if so, how?
So examples I like to give are not perfectly similar to the United States, because the countries that I like to mention as positive examples and case studies of countries that were able to turn their budgets around as they were experiencing high interest rates and heading towards a debt crisis, they were never countries that also had the global reserve currency status the way in the US does. So I have to mention that caveat because I think that is an important caveat, because what that means is that the countries I'm about to mention actually had a hard fiscal constraint, right? Their ability to borrow was not as loose as, say, we have in the United States, where we have the ability to export a lot of our inflation and create more currency for being the global reserve currency and one of the major trading currencies. So with that caveat, I like to mention Switzerland, Germany, and Sweden. New Zealand is actually also another really good example for how some countries have turned things around. So in looking at very high interest rates and resultingly high debt service costs, usually in the 90s, Canada is actually another example. Canada did like a 20% spending cut, and their economy roared as a result. Germany and Switzerland adopted constitutional debt breaks to restrain their politicians, signal to markets. In Germany, this was happening during after the Great Recession, that Germany was committed to reducing its debt burden following the crisis and to keeping interest rates low going forward. And that worked. And then Sweden, similar to Switzerland in the 90s, suffered high interest rates and economic recession. And in many of those instances, countries did use commissions to reform healthcare and pension programs, and also used constitutional amendments, constitutional restraints to keep their politicians from breaking fiscal commitments. But also many of these countries, Switzerland excluded, but Sweden and Germany have very high tax burdens. So that's something to keep in mind. They do have value-added taxes. And so for them, it was less about reducing the size and scope of government as much as it was ensuring that they had enough tax revenue to finance their welfare states. They did have to make some tough choices when it comes to their entitlement programs. But also they're much more willing to tax their population, so that gets them out of the bind in some ways. I love the Swiss example because they're more about limiting the growth in the central government and allowing for their state cantonal governments to play a bigger role. But they also have an easier path than we do because their healthcare is already managed at the state or cantonal level. So their debt break doesn't have to deal with out-of-control healthcare costs. That is part of a different government level. They also don't have automatic withholding the way we have in the US, meaning in Switzerland, people actually go to their government office every quarter, the way that businesses pay taxes here in the United States and actually pay their taxes. And so Swiss citizens are uniquely aware of how much their government is costing them, and they don't suffer from the fiscal illusion we have in the United States, where people think that if they get a tax refund, that's like a government benefit check. And so the Swiss are much more intent on limiting the size of their government as a result of that. So those are some of the examples I would mention with the resulting caveats.
So I want to ask you about, like, I wonder if, do you think it's more probable that we'll have the situation of a huge potential default and crisis, or something that's going to be more like marginal changes that lead us to be something more like Europe? I mean, I think the Canada example, again, I agree is not totally relevant because of the difference in dollar dominance, and that, look, you know, we have this supplement basically that makes it cheaper for us to borrow, and in some ways that's good. In other ways, it magnifies the problem of us having an easier time taking on more debt. You know, Canada did like cut their spending almost in half, which was amazing. I mean, it's still higher than the United States, but it's like they waited until they were at the precipice, and so, you know, if that happens in the United States, it's not clear that we would get a political outcome, and maybe we face then being at the edge of the cliff. Whereas I think of the European examples are much more like, look, we get smaller reforms, which means we have higher taxes, we probably have, you know, different changes, some changes in the welfare state, and then we end up with like very low GDP growth and higher unemployment rates. That just means our economy is instead limping along and never really growing. I mean, do you have thoughts about which of those things are more likely for the US right now?
So I'm curious what you think about this too, and anyone else who has thought about these questions, but I wonder if we're going to actually have that like precipice advance notice the way that Canada did and the way that these other countries did, or if we're much more prone to basically living under sunny skies and then the downpour comes all at once. And what I'm thinking here is the way that the U.S. dollar prominence affects treasury markets, and that we're seeing this winner-takes-all nature in our treasury markets for the most part, where it's dollar dominance until it isn't. And so I worry that we might not have that advance notice to make those marginal reforms, but that when we suffer a fiscal crisis, that everything will come crashing down all at once, and the political system won't be able to adjust anymore. Also, the herd behavior we observe in treasury markets, where people will keep buying U.S. treasury bonds until the music stops, you know? That's my concern, you know? We won't have the ability to adjust. We sort of have to adjust with enough foresight to prevent the meltdown. And if we don't do that, we are basically subscribing ourselves to experiencing the meltdown.
I'm a bit crypto native, so I might be coming at this differently. But one of the most interesting things that happened to me, or like happened in the industry as I saw it, is the U.S. basically created the conditions for infinite innovation on the dollar in a crypto sense by not issuing a CBDC and saying we're not going to do that thing. And so I think what's the question in there? Like, you mentioned that the dollar has a dominant status that's unparalleled. if innovation flows to crypto dollars, do you think it'll flow unequally, towards U.S. dollars, or that would essentially erode the U.S. dollar dominance?
So the U.S. government, and you might know more about this than I do, is sort of betting that the stablecoin legislation they're currently pursuing will tie crypto to the dollar and will reinforce dollar dominance going forward.
Yeah, that's what they're hoping. I mean, the question is whether the banks will get hold of that legislation and limit stablecoins to licensed banks, which will be the death of the industry. That'll be the death of innovation. But I think the dollar's dominance doesn't face any immediate threat from China because Chinese financial markets are not open. They have exchange controls. Nobody's going to put a large part of their savings in yuan. Putting together a coalition of parties who would like to escape the dollar, we'll see if they can come to any kind of agreement. That's going to be tough.
Might face the OPEC issues, huh?
I thought the euro was going to give more competition to the dollar, but it's, as somebody said this morning, it's turned out to be just a mirror image of the dollar.
Larry, on that point about the undesirability of Chinese currency or Chinese assets, is that something that you think the Chinese Communist Party could strategically change at a certain point if they decided they wanted to just like ditch the benefits they've had up until now and instead embrace, renminbi reserve status? Or is it something that by the nature of the way their government's organized or other things that would cause the Western world to not trust them, that there's really no way in which they could make any active decision to like change the demand and appetite for their currency and assets?
I think it comes down to a political economy question, which is, are they willing to let their currency float in a way that strengthens it to the short-run disadvantage of their exporters? I mean, exporters in many countries have been the force that says, no, you can't do that. You got to cheapen the currency for our sake. Even in Switzerland, the Swiss National Bank, which has a very good track record on inflation compared to others, at one point they fixed to the euro because the Swiss franc was getting so strong their exporters were crying. So whether China's willing to take that step, but their whole view is that the state needs to control these things, and that's a very hard idea to let go of.
Even if no, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to add to that, so not only would the Chinese government have to do that, they would have to do it in a way that everyone else trusted that they would follow through on it. So that's not an easy thing. I think like maybe it was a year ago that there was this announcement that the BRICS countries might try to do a gold-backed currency that they would get together. And I was doing some interviews and people would ask me like, oh, do you think this would be like a new gold standard? And I said, well, the gold standard requires trust that people are going to redeem the gold, right? It requires strong property rights. Like China and Russia are not countries that you think of as having strong property rights, right? So nobody's going to trust that unless they could really commit to it. And so it's hard to believe that those countries could make any real commitment to the international community that they're not going to devalue their currencies. I would say one other thing, though, about U.S. dollar dominance is that it's not just about the central bank. I disagree a little bit with our speaker from this morning that was worried about decline in foreign investment in the United States, because I don't think of it as just being about interest rates. I think the U.S. economy is stronger than almost any other economy in the world, and the lack of regulation and the dynamism and innovation that we have here is just unmatched anywhere else. And as long as that's the case, people are going to want to invest in the United States. I mean, if you're looking at the stock markets of any other country around the world, including Europe and the UK, like those countries just aren't creating any value in their markets the way that the United States does. And as long as that's true, we're going to continue to have people that want to invest in the United States. I mean, unless you think other countries around the world are going to be seriously cutting their regulations, people are going to still want to invest here, which also increases this problem of, well, then it's going to be harder for us to get a good signal of, are people seriously worried about the government securities, and are they going to be pulling out of that? You know, it makes it a little bit more volatile that we would worry about this being a precipice that we.
May I add? I think it won't take much more of a marginal drying up of demand from sovereigns that will have a massive. It doesn't take the dollar to be knocked out as the world reserve currency for there to be massive inflation in the U.S. And even I know China's been offloading treasuries, and so have other countries for several years. And we're starting to see stealth QE from the Fed purchasing on the back end themselves, and so that doesn't show up right away in inflation, but it will. And so if it takes a marginal reduction in the demand for U.S. dollars or treasuries abroad for there to be massive consequences here, so that I don't see there's no other currency that can knock the dollar off as a world reserve currency for the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean that we will not have massive problems in the U.S. And China is pushing towards that in lots of ways. I know we discussed some of those in their central bank digital currency. That the code for their currency has been embedded into the national banks of the countries that have took part in the MBridge project. I think UAE, Thailand, Singapore, I think are the countries. So they're making those efforts. One other really interesting thing to talk about stablecoins and digital tokens and how that may bolster demand for dollars. I work for the Digital Chamber Industry Trade Association. I focus on national security policy, and so I've been tracking some of these things. There's a group some of you guys may have heard of called the Huoyne Group. I may be pronouncing it wrong, but it's out of Cambodia. They're basically a crime syndicate that runs a dark web marketplace that all kinds of activity takes place on. They've recently moved from using Tether as their main currency to facilitate transactions, because Tether has now been working with TRM and Tron to help freeze some of the bad activity that's happening with their token. They've created their own stablecoin that has even less ability to be frozen than Tether's. And who knows what, if anything, it's backed up with. But that's a really interesting and sort of a troubling change or advancement, because in the lawless or the places outside the reach of U.S. sanctions and influence, that could be a massive issue where we're hoping that the dollar is bolstered by the legislation here. But if you have third countries, I don't mean third world in the sense of third world, but I should say third party countries that are don't care about relations with the U.S. and they care more about relations with China, then they could contribute to instability in the dollar's use and the dollar network, and then help sanctions evasion. And so those are some interesting points that I've kind of come across recently.
What is stealth QE and how does it work?
I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that the Fed is basically repurchasing the treasuries themselves, because there's been a lack of demand for the offerings that the recent monthly offerings. So there was something like 10 billion, I think, was the latest repurchase. I don't know if anybody else has more understanding or knowledge about that, but it's not pure money printing, but they're purchasing the bonds, the treasuries themselves.
When you say stable, peg to what?
Well, so that in the case of this group in Cambodia, it's a dollar stablecoin that they're using, but what it's pegged to or what's backing it, who knows, if anything.
But pegged to the dollar. Could a case be made that it's a counterfeit dollar? Is there?
In essence, that's what it is. I think, is a counterfeit dollar, because I don't know that they're not keeping anything.
Or I guess distance from issuance would sort of become a property you'd have to track. But the U.S. is taking a position that they still issue dollars, but they're not, the actual mechanism is open to innovation, I think is fine. But then you have to draw a line somewhere and say, just like you do in the physical world, a copy of a dollar isn't a dollar. Right now, everything in crypto that isn't backed by a bank account full of cash is essentially a copy of a dollar. So like, where do you draw that line, you know?
So in addition to what might happen with inflation and the dollar, I'm also worried about the economic growth implications of the federal expansion of what's consumption spending primarily among the elderly as well, and how much of the economy is shifting towards consumption by the elderly, and how much that's eating into the available capital and other resources that can be deployed for innovation. So it might be a really bad sign that that there is no alternative to the U.S. dollar and allows the U.S. government to continue unsustainable fiscal policy for longer. That doesn't mean that there are not real-world consequences of that spending in the form of absorbing resources that would have otherwise gone to better uses, higher productivity uses. And as a result,
Would it be possible to sort of say that in example terms to make sure we understand what you mean by that?
well, most of the government's borrowing right now is not to make investments in defense or education or to maintain our infrastructure, but like 70% of spending right now is interest on the debt, which pays bondholders, and is transfers, income transfers, where the government primarily pays for healthcare consumption of the elderly population, and then some poor people, and then income transfers primarily again to elderly people through Social Security for consumption purposes, and you know, some of that money will end up in markets and in stocks, and can support a growing economy, but a lot of it is also just going towards consumption. Because, you know, when you're at that age, in your 70s, 80s, unless you're saving for the next generation, like, you should be using it while you can. And so because so much of that money is also borrowed, it pushes up interest rates, which makes it more difficult for startups to raise money because it messes with their evaluations. And it makes it more difficult for businesses to get loans as well, because you have to show a much higher return to be able to cover the cost of your loan when the interest is so high.
It sounded from your presentation earlier like adding a transaction tax, like a value-added tax, would not be appealing from your perspective, even though it could potentially raise tax revenues higher. Is that right? Or would you say that you think overall, just thinking about the overall economy, that would not be a good tool to bring to bear in this situation? Or do you think it should be part of a solution?
So if we were to transition to a consumption tax away from our current distortionary income tax system, I would be a lot more interested. But I'm not excited about the prospect of the government consuming even more of the capital by increasing the overall tax burden. Because we also have to keep in mind, in my presentation, I focused on the federal government, but we already have, you know, sales taxes at the state level. The overall tax burden on Americans is already pretty close, if you look at OECD data, to what Europeans pay if you add in our state and local and property taxes. And so the more money that the government takes in whatever tax form it does so, the less money is available for people to spend and invest. And so that will depress growth. I also don't love the idea of fueling the growth in government because value-added tax could potentially not be used towards paying down unfunded obligations down the road for programs like Social Security and Medicare, but could create short-term surpluses that then would allow for the creation of new government entitlement programs. Like Democrats are trying to put in place a universal basic income program. They've talked about federalizing long-term care even more than is already the case with Medicaid, and making a lot of those benefit promises explicit. The Biden administration put in place significantly new subsidies for the green energy transition. There's a lot more in the Green New Deal energy playbook that politicians would love to spend U.S. taxpayer money on. Yeah, so for all those reasons, that's also one of the reasons I'm not excited about lifting the Social Security tax cap. If you actually did the Bernie Sanders plan, where you create a donut hole and you basically tax all income above $400,000, it would create about 5 years of surplus revenue, and you can count on that not being saved for Social Security, and that it'll end up being used towards other government expansions. And so you're just putting us deeper in a hole over the long term. So yeah, I mean, you can raise more money if that's what you want to do, but it comes at the cost of freedom, choice, and you may end up with a bigger government and a deeper fiscal hole down the road.
Yeah, and again, this is when I had asked before about, look, are we going to be faced with a big cliff, or are we going to do some small marginal improvement adjustments that raise taxes and have more government spending that are potentially crowding out businesses and innovation, that put us in the path to being like Europe, where we're not actually growing and we're not increasing people's incomes, and we get stuck in a scenario where, we've slowed our spending, or we've slowed our deficits by increasing taxes so much that the economy can't grow anymore. And I think that's pretty worrisome.
Yes. What worries me about this scenario being more likely than the entitlement reforms that I would propose we should make instead is that anytime the government can find a way to place blame on another entity, that becomes a lot more attractive. And both inflation and consumption taxes have the added benefit from a government perspective of acting like hidden taxes. We've already seen President Trump telling companies like Walmart that have suggested they may need to increase their prices to make up for the tariffs that the administration is imposing, to say, no, you should eat the tariffs. You should bear the cost, because otherwise we're going to blame you. You're the ones increasing your prices, right? And it's the same thing with inflation. We had the greedflation as the new term for blaming companies who ultimately were constrained in their ability to absorb the cost of higher prices from government policy, being blamed for inflation that the government created. And a consumption tax, especially if you bury it in the overall price, and many governments have passed laws where businesses can't even detail the cost of the tax, but they're supposed to fold it in under the price that the consumer sees. It's a great way to hide the cost of government and shift the blame towards the retailers. So that makes it more attractive.
Interest rates are expected to be higher just basis in the next few years, or that's the forecast. And to draw on the point that startups will have a harder time raising money, and businesses will have a harder time acquiring capital for growth and for innovation. And to draw on Thomas's point that stocks still see a lot of demand, and earlier today Quinn also mentioned this, and with respect to demand for bonds, there's a huge disparity in preference for equities. Do you think that in that environment, valuations will come back to earth, when these growth expectations are priced in, where the environment is a higher cost of capital, innovation is harmed, and it's not so much priced on growth? And coupling this with an environment where the U.S. is losing trust from foreign investors, and we're not seeing that capital flock to buying treasuries and bonds, do you think this can start like some sort of deleveraging, where like capital starts flowing away and flocking from U.S. instruments and into something else? And if so, where would that capital flock to?
It's a good question. You let me know when you figure that out, so I can I can buy that into that market too. Okay. No, I think you raise a lot of good points, but I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to those questions. Yeah.
Is there like any sort of indication, or I guess schools of thoughts on what might happen if that scenario played out? Is there anyone that is proponent of like where would that capital be allocated to, or like is it even, or does it just mean that it's a very unlikely scenario?
So the only scenarios that I have run have been for the U.S. military, because they have also looked at how the fiscal situation will affect U.S. Security going forward, and there's clear implications if our economy grows more slowly, if serious alternatives to the dollar emerge, if we suffer a fiscal crisis. Defense has already been constrained in spending. It may not seem that way to libertarians. Perhaps I also may think that we're spending too much on defense, but it depends on the role that you envision the U.S. to play globally. And if you want a global military, then you need to make higher expenditures to actually realize those goals. But in terms of where private market capital will flow to, I don't know, Singapore maybe? What
Yeah.
countries are doing well?
So this all also depends on what you believe is going to happen with the rest of the world, right? Because we also, we thought the same thing more than a decade ago, that, oh, well, the United States, we're having such a huge deficit that our interest rates are going to go up, and eventually it's going to force us into this decision. And then after 2008, when again we thought, well, we have this huge crisis in the United States and all the investment's going to flow out, and none of that happened because everywhere else was worse. And the United States has, for the decade after 2008, had slower growth and a worse economy. But everywhere else was still worse than us, right? And so if we're going to have problems, are they going to be unique to the United States? Are those problems, especially if they're going to cause inflation and other things that are going to affect the rest of the world? Are we still going to be the leader there? It's hard to make those guesses. And when we've done it before and thought already that we would be facing this fiscal cliff in terms of higher interest rates, like it just hasn't happened yet. And so, it's hard to say.
Some ways in which it might become more likely, though, is a decline in science funding. Scientists leaving the United States and going to other countries. China is attracting a lot of the scientists that the U.S. government has decided to no longer support. And immigration policy, I think, is a big driver, because we've attracted a lot of ambitious people who've also started businesses and grown some of our biggest businesses here in the United States. And if we ruin a lot of those components that attract brain power and capital, then over the long term, we're setting ourselves up for decline. So a lot of the policies we are pursuing right now in tandem are actually a lot of the costs of those policies we won't realize until many years down the road, which makes them so dangerous because you don't adjust early enough. So, China would love to pick up where we left off. They have other problems, but it depends how bad things get here, right? Then China starts looking a lot more attractive.
So to your question earlier about where the capital would go to, I've been also thinking about the same problem. I think if it's a violent deleveraging, then would be a general flight to safety. That would be just cash and treasuries in the near term, or maybe gold. But of course, in very violent deleveraging scenarios, all the asset correlations goes to 1, everything falls. I think that some people are accumulating cash at this moment because they're expecting that outcome. I do think long-term capital certain types of capital can move freely across borders, and they will chase markets where there's real GDP growth as well as real productivity gains. So maybe in the short term, we haven't really faced that scenario, but over time, I think for people who can move capital, they will go to those markets with better yield, better return.
Yeah, some people told me India and Latin America are looking like more attractive options.
Thank you for your presentation this morning and today. I think there's broad-based consensus that we're on an imprudent and unsustainable fiscal path. It's either Plan A, what do we do to avoid a crisis, or Plan B, what do we do in the face of a crisis? Personally, I'm for Plan A. In that regard, there's three components: pro-growth, additional revenues, and reduced spending. Right now, we're taxing below the post-World War II average as a percentage of GDP. I'm not talking about how we get the money, but how much money we're getting. We're spending well above the post-World War II average, and it's expected to go up. And so the question is, in trying to achieve a consensus that's politically feasible, because that's what a lot of people forget about, okay? It's got to be politically feasible. Then what's the right ratio? What's the ratio? We'll get as much as we can out of growth, but we're not growing our way out of this problem. That math just says there ain't no way that's happening. So what's the ratio of projected spending reduction, including interest, which is spending, okay, and projected revenue increase? Not how we get it, but the ratio, so that we can get the gap below the growth of the economy for a while, and then no more than the growth of the economy over time. Is it like 2-to-1, 3-to-1?
I think it depends on your political preference.
Well, I'm talking about what's politically feasible. I mean, I know that, but I mean, the point is, it's got to pass the House. It's, you know, unless it's budget reconciliation, it's got to get 60 votes in the Senate. Social Security can't be done on budget reconciliation, so it's going to take at least 60 votes in the Senate. So let's say that we got to do Social Security separately, which is what AARP wants, and I think it's the right way to do it anyway, especially given budget reconciliation. The question is to try to achieve a reasonable level of debt to GDP, which you talked about this morning, properly so, okay? Then how much of it should be revenue increases versus spending reduction? We can debate how to achieve it, you know. I agree with you. I'd rather go to a progressive consumption tax and get rid of what we got now. I mean, that's much more efficient, okay? But, you know, the odds of going from here to there overnight are not very good, as you know.
I actually think that it would not be the best scenario to do Social Security separately, because the reason I think groups like AARP want to do this is because it makes non-solutions like raising the payroll tax cap look like solutions, but that only works if you ignore that Medicare is a much bigger problem, right? And if you're using all of the tax resources for Social Security, you have nothing left for Medicare. And that's why I think it's actually important to do those together, so we can consider the proper trade-offs and not treat Social Security as if it was a problem in isolation. It's actually the smaller problem.
I agree with that. The practical problem, though, is under the Byrd rule, you cannot do Social Security as part of budget reconciliation.
Right, but it's not like any party is going to do major entitlement reform on a partisan basis. I don't think we have to worry about reconciliation for that.
50 votes is 51's a lot different than 60. That's all. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but we've basically seen reconciliation used as a partisan tool, not to solve any problems, but primarily enact your political agenda and, for the most part, make all of our fiscal problems worse. Because, we are still operating in this cycle of whichever party is in power wants to drain the public coffers as much as they can to buy favors for their own constituencies and ideally constrain the next generation from doing the same. But at this point, we just have successive political coffer draining and no one has gotten stuck with actually solving the problem yet. But someone's going to get stuck with it in 2032 when the Medicare and Social Security trust funds are officially depleted, and then they're actually going to have to do something. So that's sort of the deadline if you're thinking about when something serious might happen, most likely 2032.
So I think an interesting idea, like way to think about this kind of is think of it like DeFi. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of people here are used to thinking of, man, how do we design a contract or a market or something when we know people are going to get in there and try to exploit it and try to create all the loopholes, and we need to create something that's incentive compatible and trackable and as transparent as possible. But most people don't think about the government like that. And they think, well, Congress and the House and the Senate are going to come together and they're going to realize that this is a crisis and they're going to do the right thing. And that is not how that works. Everyone in there in Congress has their own incentives, just like people using the DeFi protocols do. And I think Romina did a good job this morning thinking about a couple of proposals that would make it incentive compatible, where Congress has some like cover your ass ability, right? Where they don't have to go to voters and say, hey, I voted to take money away from you. But instead they can say, look, we created this commission to do the right thing, and they chose something that's in some ways harmful for our people, but there's nothing I could do about it. Thinking about the incentives of Congress, and is there a way where we can create some kind of system where it's going to be okay for them to pass these budget cuts, essentially. I mean, even though they're not really cuts, relative to the baseline at least, that they can face their voters and say, look, we did the best thing, and even though this outcome harms some people, it's something that is beneficial for all Americans. Like for all of us that think about incentives, that's one way to think about this problem.
I appreciate that framing. I do think that activates some of the right mindsets for people in this room, because, some of us have spent hundreds or thousands of hours of thinking about how these different governance systems would be gamed on chain, and it really is the same dynamic at the end of the day. Romina, on that point, I'm curious. So it sounds like you must have done the research of all past attempts at things like this to find that example that seems like the most analogous case. Is that something that you or others have discussed with members of Congress, and what's the initial reaction on is it politically feasible to basically take that same sort of approach with something that would be, so much more of a national issue than just decommissioning army bases? Do you have any indication of interest?
Yes. So last year and the year leading up to it, House Speaker McCarthy endorsed a BRAC-like fiscal commission. Speaker Mike Johnson endorsed it when he was running for House Speaker. It became a litmus test. Are you a serious Republican who is serious about resolving our fiscal crises? Then you will support a BRAC-like fiscal commission. George Will, who's a conservative commentator, endorsed a proposal in the Washington Post. Jody Arrington, who's currently the House Budget Committee chair and one of the key leaders behind the president's tax bill, also endorsed the proposal to the press. I've had conversations with Paul Ryan about it, who endorsed it at a public event that we had together. I've also talked with members of Congress behind the scenes, and one of the things that happened is last year, the House Budget Committee favorably voted a bill out of commission that would establish a bipartisan fiscal commission, the Fiscal Commission Act or Fiscal Stability Act, that was introduced by Scott Peters from California and Bill Huizenga. Is he from Michigan? Yes. Yeah. And when that bill first came together, it looked almost exactly like the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and I was able to help shape it in a way where they started broadening the commission composition to include independent experts and also to not only consider a goal of stabilizing the debt over 15 years, but also score long-term improvements to the Medicare and Social Security trust funds, so we could get some longer-term reforms that may not have big savings in a 10 or 15-year window, but that could make a real difference over 30, 50 years. In terms of moving that bill even closer to a BRAC-like fiscal commission, what would be required is basically turn the members of Congress into like an oversight board, but allow the experts to actually hash out the details of the proposals, and then ideally get Congress out of having to affirmatively vote in both the House and the Senate before the bill can go into effect, and instead delegate that authority to the president, ideally a second-term president, because they can take the political hit. They can't run for office again anyway, so great. Please sacrifice for the nation. And then Congress could avoid having to vote for it. And they could even stage opposition. People who are in really risky districts might come together and try to oppose the bill. And as long as they don't have enough members of Congress that can oppose the bill and overcome a presidential veto, then it gives Congress the cover to say, we tried everything and we failed. The problem is that there's grassroots groups on both sides of the aisle that ultimately killed the Fiscal Commission Act last year as we were heading into an election cycle, and that are opposed to strengthening the current approach so it looks more like a BRAC-like fiscal commission, because they know that it would work, right? And they don't actually want to achieve the political outcomes that would be necessary to fix our debt crises. So you have groups like Americans for Tax Reform, who I like in many ways, but not on this issue, that do not seem to consider current deficit and debt increases as future taxes. So they're solely focused on avoiding any grand bargain that might increase direct taxes. And then you have groups on the other side, like Social Security Works and the National Committee to Preserve Medicare and Social Security, that have huge grassroots followings that are opposed to any grand bargain that would reduce future Social Security and Medicare benefits. And so they want members of Congress to have to vote to make those changes. And they don't want to allow independent experts to actually have the delegated powers from Congress to make those decisions. And they've been blocking the effort. And so members of Congress feel constrained in supporting a BRAC-like fiscal commission because they'll get hit over the head by these groups, either for endorsing tax increases or for endorsing benefit reductions. And so the way that things are right now is nobody's been willing to introduce or even write such a bill. So I'm looking for a sponsor in this respect. And then if we had a bill, if we could get enough support behind the scenes without people signing on as official co-sponsors, and members of Congress knew that the votes were there, if they all voted for it, maybe we could get it across the finish line, but it would have to be sort of a stealth effort until you have enough support such that basically you achieve a political accord that we're going to hand this off to this commission. We've already agreed on who's going to be on the commission, so we have some sense of what outcomes we might be able to expect. I think Congress will still want to be in the driver's seat to that degree, but then otherwise we're going to set this process in motion and let it play out.
Is there high-quality polling on what Americans today think about this issue? Like if this were to be sort of, if we just forget about our whole current system and this were just put to a vote to American citizens, do we know what they would vote for and against? And I guess a similar question for anyone in the room who knows this, like what is the level of understanding of these issues among average Americans today?
So you see a lot of support when you approach it from the high level. The question of should Congress work together to stabilize the debt? Should Congress work together to avoid a debt crisis? you will get 75, 80% support across political groups. It's when you get into the details of, should Congress increase the retirement age? Should Congress means test Social Security? That's when you get very low support numbers. It's in the specifics where you lose people, and in the overarching goal where you can make gains. And so if you look at like what New Zealand did, what Sweden and Germany and Switzerland did when they adopted their fiscal rules, and when they made spending reductions and program reforms, is they focused on the goal, stabilizing the debt, because that's where public support is, and then intentionally left the specific decisions to usually an expert commission. And then in the European context, they would vote it into place. But it seems easier to vote changes into place in Europe for some reason. You see a lot of reforms. The UK did a major overhaul of its retirement programs, things that just don't seem feasible in the United States system, the way it's set up. But that's how you have to do it. You focus on the goal, what are we trying to accomplish, stabilize the debt, strike a more fair social contract across the generations, and that's where you have support.
To reinforce that, I've done citizen education engagement in 47 states, 2 territories, several countries. The people are way ahead of the politicians. And the way I approached it in dealing with forums where you had representative groups of voters, age, race, income, political affiliation, is first start on, do you believe we have a crisis that needs to be addressed? Over 90%, okay? Do you believe that the answer is to let's stabilize debt as a percentage of the economy? Over 90%. Do you believe that we should do it sooner rather than later? Over 90%. Do you believe that the problem is primarily a spending problem but not exclusively a spending problem? Over 90%, okay? What ratio do you believe is appropriate for spending reductions versus revenue increases? 3 to 1, including interest. 3 to 1 spending, 1 part revenue. And if you reduce interest, that's spending, right? By over 80%. What are the principles and values that should guide the decision-making? And, you know, and Romina is right on the key point. What's the goal, right? I mean, how do we measure success, right? And they agree we've got to do something. We gave them 6 and got 87%, okay? Pro-growth, socially equitable, culturally acceptable, mathematical integrity, politically feasible, and meaningful bipartisan support, over 80%. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details, all right? And the lowest percentage agreement we got, and we did it by packages, tax reforms, Social Security reforms, healthcare reforms, defense reforms, government. We did it as packages for one of the reasons you talked about, because if you try to do it on individual elements, you know, it's going nowhere. On the other hand, with packages, you know, there's good and bad in there. You got to compromise, keep the goal. The minimum we got was 77%, and that was for Social Security, all the way up to well over 90%, depending upon what the topic was. So the bottom line is Simpson-Bowles was fundamentally flawed because A, it wasn't statutory, so there was no guarantee they would ever get a vote. Secondly, they had to have a 75% vote in order to even consider their recommendations. Thirdly, they did zero citizen education and engagement, which is the key to success, okay? And ultimately, the president abandoned them. And so, you know, I think we need to learn the lessons from Simpson-Bowles. My only concern is you and I are experts that might end up being on a commission, okay, which is good. I think you got to have experts. My concern is, what do the optics look like under the following scenario? We're going to pick 10 or 15 experts that have never been elected to anything. We're going to give them the power to recommend tax reforms, social insurance reforms, government spending reductions, okay? We're then going to send it to the president, who doesn't have the power of the purse, who's under the Constitution, you know, makes a bid but doesn't control spending, doesn't control tax policy, right? And this particular president, no matter what you think of him, is polarizing, all right? and then we're going to send it to Congress and say, you can sit on your butt and do nothing, and it becomes law. I just don't think that's politically feasible. I think they're going to have to take a vote. They're going to have to take a vote. There are ways you can do it, and I totally agree with Romina that the goals, debt to GDP, got to have citizen education engagement, got to have experts on it, but I think in the end they're going to have to vote. And the only reason I say to separate Social Security from everything else, because I used to be on the board of AARP, so I know how powerful they are on both sides. And I know that the Republicans are scared the hell of them too, And again, and because of the Byrd rule in the Senate, that you can't consider Social Security reforms under budget reconciliation, where all this other stuff we can. We can consider all this other stuff under budget reconciliation, and the less votes we got to have to get it done, the more likely I think you'll get it done. But
And when you say Congress is going to have to take a vote, do you mean that Congress would never vote to pass legislation that would entail the mechanism that's being proposed in the first place? They would only be willing to...
No, they would do two things. They would vote to create the commission and the composition, of the commission. They might give the commission a goal. We want the commission to come up with recommendations that will achieve X percent of debt to GDP by Y date, which would be good, I think. And they would tell the commission, we want you to engage in broad-based citizen education engagement, educate the public, listen to their input, and then make a package. I would argue 2 packages of recommendations. Reasonable people can differ on that. And then they'd have to vote on that package.
But when you say they have to vote, you mean under the Constitution, it wouldn't be legal for them to pass a law that basically established
let's look at
and
it this
delegated
way.
this power? Or do you mean that they wouldn't choose to, even though they could?
What I'm saying is I don't think it passes the straight-face test from the standpoint of our system of government, that the party that has the power of the purse, that sets tax policy, that sets spending policy, can do nothing, and major changes become
Well, they're
law.
not doing nothing. They're setting up the mechanism.
Yeah,
They're
they're
asking the
setting the
commission for
mechanism,
help,
right.
and they're setting the goals that the commission would need to accomplish. So from a delegation standpoint, as long as Congress is sufficiently specific about what the commission should accomplish and how the final product will be judged, whether it meets those criteria, I've suggested that they should employ the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office to certify that the commission is within the goals and instructions that Congress has provided. Constitutionally, you could definitely get away with it. I think what Dave is trying to say is that it's not the question then, and is it more politically feasible for Congress to put that mechanism in place and then sit on its hands, or to actually have to vote on a final package? And a lot of people differ on what they think. I think it's actually less politically feasible if Congress has to vote on the specific details, which is why I'm focused on getting it across the finish line.
Let me just mention one thing to give you an example. Let's compare it to what the process is for rescissions. Doge came up with alleged, waste, abuse, whatever. Only Congress can cut spending. Doge can't cut a dime other than hiring freezes.
But Congress could have authorized Doge with reorganization authority,
Right, but they
and
didn't.
then Doge could have cut
Right,
spending.
but
They
they
chose
didn't.
not to.
Right, but the way the law is right now, if you want to cut spending, the president has to propose to Congress. Congress has 45 days to say yes. If they sit on their keister, the answer is no. I think that needs to be flipped.
Right?
Okay?
Yes.
That needs to be flipped, given where our fiscal situation is. It should automatically be yes unless the Congress says no.
Agreed.
All right? But that's a lower threshold than veto override.
Yes,
So-
and the reason I argue that
Yeah.
it's okay is also in part
Yeah.
politically, because Congress long ago abdicated spending responsibility. Yes, in theory, they control the purse strings, but they decided to let the purse strings go by putting in place laws that allow for the automatic growth of these healthcare and retirement programs without Congress ever taking a vote. I'd be curious to count how many of the current members of Congress and senators ever took a vote that authorized any of that spending.
Well, bottom line, I think it'd be good if we could do that. I'm just questioning whether it's feasible. That's all I'm
Yeah.
saying. If we could do it that way, hey, I'm okay. Especially if you have independent experts
We
that
have
actually
to
know
make
something
what's
about
currently politically impossible feasible.
Yeah, totally, totally. All right, we are coming up at the end of our time here. Thanks everyone for participating in this conversation. Romina, if you could close this out with just any further information about, if anyone here in this room or watching this on the internet wants to learn more about this particular direction we've just been discussing, how can they learn more about that? How could they get involved in that?
Sign up for my Substack, the Debt Dispatch, because it's not just my own content. I curate the very best content on fiscal issues, and I often host counter views as well. Some Democrats even choose to write for the Debt Dispatch because of the audience that we reach. So that's a great way to keep in touch. We'll keep you up to date on what's happening in Congress. And if people want to get more involved on a grassroots issue, I don't do that, but there are organizations like the Concord Coalition, No Labels, that are a little more active in the grassroots side, on the grassroots side of things.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.